Hey there, folks. Welcome to another episode of the Bulwarg Disclosure Podcast. We're going to talk about some really interesting things today. Of course, in the milieu of things that we always discuss, mind control, social engineering, psychedelics. But this is coming from someone who really has firsthand experience within these topics. A personal close friend and associate of Timothy Leary, author of many books on the topic of psychedelics. We have Robert Forte here with us today. Robert, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure, Noah. Thanks for checking in on me, all the way from Cincinnati.
Yes, and Robert, you're out in Greece.
I'm on the south eastern coast of Attica, a little bit south of Athens, Greece. Yes, where I live, where
And
I emigrated about a year ago.
you told
Yeah.
me you moved there about a year ago from California. Where did you live in California prior to that?
Well, for really most of my life, for 45 years, I lived in most of that 45 years in Santa Cruz, California.
Hmm.
I was born in the Northeast, born in Boston, raised in Boston and outside of New York City and New Jersey. Went to college a few places there. Went to UC Santa Cruz, transferred there from Columbia University in New York. And California was amazing. And I pretty much stayed there. A little stint in graduate school in the Midwest at the University of Chicago. But thought I was going to live the whole rest of my life in this beautiful paradise up in the redwoods in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And then 4 years ago, almost exactly, these fires came in and burned the whole place down. My house and hundreds of others, and just kind of forced migration. I'm a little concerned now because my son is still out in California, in the south, in the San Bernardino Mountains, where, as you may know, there's enormous fires burning, and he was evacuated last night, and it's a little scary, but yeah.
Yeah, well,
But
we're
yeah,
keeping
here I
in
am
our
in
thoughts.
Greece.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
fantastic. Well, some people might know you from, your books, your work as an author. You, of course, the your book that you wrote about Timothy Leary, Outside Looking In, which is kind of this collection of um, essays and interviews with people that interacted with him and were friends with him throughout his life. And some people might assume kind of that you are a proponent of psychedelic drugs just from the people that you've worked with and your career path and stuff. But since I guess kind of around the early 2000s, you've come out to kind of bring awareness to what you call the dark side of psychedelics and psychedelic history. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into that and what your career consisted of, some of the people you worked with, just kind of a little overview?
Yeah, let me correct a couple of things
Sure,
because
thanks.
you said I was an author of several books, and that's not exactly true. What I really am is an editor so far of 3 books. That book on Timothy, I compiled it. I wrote some of it. I wrote a lengthy introduction. My first book is called Entheogens and the Future of Religion, which is a book I'm still very proud of, that I started really back when I was in graduate school at the University of Chicago, working with Stanislav Grof and at Esalen. I was kind of bilocated between Esalen and the University of Chicago. And it's a collection of writings that I collected, some at a major conference that I organized and some interviews and things that I conducted afterwards. So I'm just sensitive to this. I'm not an author yet. I was in the middle of writing a book, a memoir, when my house burned down. And so now I'm kind of regrouped and I'm getting ready to go at it again. I will be an author. And I also want to pause when you say the dark history of psychedelics, because I don't like that. I don't like that word dark. I know 1 or 2 of my podcasts call that, but I'd prefer to call it the hidden history. And because it's not dark, dark has that sort of feeling of a foreboding or, and I like to think that I'm cheerfully exposing and telling the whole story about this marvelous ancient and modern history of psychedelic drugs. Um, Proponents. You know, I've gone through several stages in my life with them since I was a child in the 1960s when they first came into my world. Um, I was kind of fascinated by them, afraid of them. I saw the dangers. I saw I saw what the casualties of people. You know, I was 10 years old in 1966. And I saw, you know, people just a little bit older than me. Acid just came flooding into this community where I lived, and people were getting fucked up. I didn't see any positive effects. I swore that I would never go near them. I was into nature and sports, and but then I got interested in meditation. I'm an athlete. I'm a very fine golfer, and I got interested in meditation to help my concentration. And I learned meditation had a very profound effect on my life. I became curious, who invented meditation? How did ancient people come up with these technologies, these metaphysical systems that were so profoundly effective and changed my life? So I began to study the history of religion when I was at Columbia. And there I learned that that the most ancient form of spiritual practice in the history of India was, you know, this culture called the Soma sacrifice, the fire sacrifice. This is where the Vedas come from, the oldest body of writings in ancient India. And the oldest of these writings is a book called the Rig Veda, and it's all about Soma, which is a plant and a drug and a ceremony and a god. And they would go out and ritually look for and find and prepare and drink this stuff that gave them visions of the nature of the universe and the role of human beings. And scholars have wondered for long time, what was Soma? And then finally, in the 1960s, a very curious fellow named R. Gordon Wasson, who was worked for J.P. Morgan, became interested in this subject and then wrote some books and then identified Soma. And I learned this in the first day of my class at Columbia on the history of Indian religion. And I just thought, wow, that is so fascinating. That all these years in my life that I thought these psychedelic mushrooms, that's what Wasson proposed Soma was, a species of an Amanita muscaria mushroom, that famous red and white mushroom, was the source of Indian religion. And so it was like a very big moment in my life. I've given podcasts, I talk about this, I still feel it. I can still see the professor writing this name on the board, Wasson. And the fact that he was a Wall Street banker and that he discovered psychedelic mushrooms in the origin of religion. And that was very fascinating to me. So it was like a moment that changed my life. It was like a calling. The 60s had come and gone. This was 1978 that I learned this. The 60s had been this big thing, the 70s, and it sort of petered out. And I thought, wow, this is so fascinating. This very rich body of information has just been eclipsed by all this hysteria of political stuff. And Timothy Leary, who I, at the time, didn't know anything about, except that he was, you know, kind of a media figure, kind of a sensational, you know, to me, he was sort of a clownish, unfortunate guy, burned out former Harvard professor, you know, that was very prestigious to me. But then he got into acid and he got burned out and he was, so I don't know, that day, I should check the astrology of that day because it really significantly changed my life. I left that class. I went to the bookstore on Broadway in New York and I found a book on psychedelics called The Joyous Cosmology by Alan Watts. And it had a preface by Timothy Leary. And I devoured the book and I read Leary's introduction and I thought, it didn't seem crazy at all to me. I mean, he's integrating all these things that are fascinating to me, like, you know, ancient mysticism, meditation, consciousness, psychology, and little did I know, this was 1978. You know, it was time for me to leave the East Coast, family stuff. I need to get away. I moved to California, enrolled at the University of California. My first classes there were with a man named Frank Barron, who a very important figure in modern psychedelic history, who was the guy who turned Timothy Leary on. They were best friends, like brothers throughout since they met in graduate school and for their whole life. And Frank started the Harvard Project, and we connected, and you know, that's how it happened. And then like over the next few years, I just wanted to, it was a calling. I wanted to learn everything. I wrote, it was still a taboo subject in this time. So if you wanted to learn something about it, you had to like, there weren't books being published, you know, you had to like, so I would just pick up the phone or write letters or hitchhike and go talk to people, and began to develop these personal relationships with, you know, almost all the significant people, men and women, who brought these drugs into the modern world. Albert Hofmann, the discoverer of LSD, was like, treated me like his grandson for a long time. I published his writings in the 3 books that I published. Wasson, you know, I was darting around the country a little bit. I spent a little time in Cambridge, not enrolled at Harvard, but my wife or partner at the time was there. And I organized a conference there. I was doing these secret conferences to try to stir up interest in the psychedelic drugs, having learned from the mistakes of the 60s. See, this is a key thing, that there were a lot of mistakes made in the 60s. Tim Leary, we considered, had made some errors. And if we could just resume the scholarly, scientific, metaphysical, meta-psychiatric, religious investigation of psychedelic drugs, we would be doing a great service to the society. Gotta hold on a second.
Yeah, you're fine.
Yeah.
Sorry, I've got a cat that's making a bunch of noise too.
That's just my phone. I just want to be sure it's not my son calling you.
Yeah, you're okay. Go ahead. No.
No, okay, that's good. Sorry. So yeah, then I met Wasson, and I, again, like a lot of these seminal figures were feeling the same way, like, oh my God, there's this body of information that we need to like freshen up and develop and share. And so I got to play this role of bringing them together and organizing conferences and books, and I was very into it. It was very exciting, and then to your question, actually sort of early on, I began to realize that there was more to this, that people that were, the psychedelic community was very vast and not unified, not homogenous. A lot of people just used drugs and had experiences and called them mystical and used them in haphazard and destructive ways. And so I began to step back a little bit. And then I began to discover that there's a whole nother layer to this, that the story, the narrative, I call it, that certain modern writers, and especially I like to point to Michael Pollan, who I've never met, but he's been kind of put in this position of being like the great spokesman or for psychedelic drugs. You know, this book that he wrote, I think it was published in 2018, you know, like kind of heralded in the new Renaissance. I mean, there's a lot of work going on between the publication of that book, before the publication of that book, but he and almost every other significant voice and podcaster in this that's promoting this Renaissance, people like Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson, you know, they put out this narrative, they put out this history. And the history is that the psychedelics were becoming known in an organic way. First, Albert Hofmann discovers LSD. Aldous Huxley writes The Doors of Perception. Gordon Wasson discovers the mushroom. Timothy Leary and Ken Kesey then get involved, and it becomes a social movement, and it becomes chaotic, and the government has to protect society. And so they make these drugs illegal, and bad Timothy Leary, caused this problem. And then they were illegal for all these years. And then this courageous group of hardworking, researchers and activists, guys like this Rick Doblin character, they come around and they're rescuing psychedelics from that period. And that's an interesting story. I used to buy it myself, but now I've learned that no, there's a whole other, much deeper and much more interesting thing going on here. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, and you mentioned a couple figures. Frank Barron, first of all, I'm sure you're familiar with High Priest, the book by Timothy Leary, where he kind of just details some of his first trips. And I think one of the first chapters is his first psilocybin experience, where he went down to Mexico with some other people. Was Frank Barron among that group?
No, Frank was not among that group. See, Frank and Tim were best friends. The history of why Frank got into it is very interesting. But Frank had the mushroom first in 1958, and he came back. He had it in Mexico. He was doing a study of creativity. Remind me, we'll go back to this, but yeah, he had the mushroom in 1958. He came back and told Tim, wow, I had this experience with this mushroom, and this is going to revolutionize American psychology. This is the thing that we've been looking for. They both had a shared path. They saw what was happening in the United States, that the United States was becoming a kind of fascist, authoritarian country with a lot of conformity and hyper-obedience. There were a lot of psychologists, personality and social psychologists in the 40s and 50s that were beginning to realize this. And Frank and Tim were veterans of World War II. They just fought a war against totalitarianism. These guys were, like staunch patriots and loved the concept of democracy. And they saw the country sliding into authoritarianism, and they devoted their careers as psychologists to averting this problem. So when Frank found the mushroom, he thought, this is the thing, this can help. And Tim, who had just been appointed to a lectureship at Harvard, told Frank, he said, Frank, I'm not gonna fuck around with any mushrooms, and you shouldn't either. You're gonna ruin we got this great position here. Frank was also at Harvard. I'm not fucking around with any mushrooms, and you shouldn't do it either. Don't even talk about them. And so Frank kind of just kept nudging Tim, and it took him a year. And then Tim went down to Mexico, and somebody offered them to him, and that was the beginning of that. So
okay. You also mentioned Gordon Wasson, which for any listeners who aren't familiar with him, he kind of was instrumental in introducing the psilocybin mushroom to the world with the famous Time magazine cover. And it sounds like you're beginning to look in this area in a different light, was kind of realizing that his history was a bit more complicated than just this JP Morgan banker with a hobby in mycology. What was it that led you to kind of suspect that side and start looking into it with Gordon Wasson?
Okay, so this is really one of the most important things to talk about. Wasson worked for JP Morgan. The story in this narrative is that he was a banker for JP Morgan, Wall Street banker. And that's, kind of true and kind of not true, because when we think of bankers, we think of, interest and currency and exchange rates and, money stuff. And Gordon Wasson was into public relations. He didn't really work with money so much. He worked with ideas and images. And JP Morgan wasn't just a bank. J.P. Morgan is a political force, a fascist political force. J.P. Morgan was a supporter of the Third Reich. He's about the concentration of wealth and the mind control of populations. And he wasn't a terrific guy. And Wasson was his fixer. Okay. And this story, it's a very charming story about how Gordon Wasson is on his honeymoon, and he and his wife find some mushrooms and they have a fight about them. She's from Russia. She loves mushrooms. He's kind of Anglo-Saxon and they hate them, and they got into this fight the first day of their marriage, and they realized what an interesting thing, that there's this profound difference between not only us as individuals, but us as our cultures. And so that became their hobby, to study mushrooms. This starts in 1927. And then 20 years goes by. They become very voracious readers. They become like world famous mycologists. They invent this field, ethnomycology, the role of mushrooms in society. And then they find out that there was a culture in Mexico that still that worshipped mushrooms, that there was a divinity associated with mushrooms, confirming an idea they had back 20 years ago, that this must be some sort of religious thing. And so they go down to Mexico, to the southern mountains of Mexico, and they find this woman, Maria Sabina. And Gordon Wasson becomes, according to the legend, the narrative, the first white man to take these mushrooms in a ceremony, a secret, 5,000-year-long tradition of using mushrooms, and has these profound visions. And then he comes back to the United States, and he writes an article in, you said Time magazine, is actually Life magazine, not that they're very different, because they're all controlled by this
Luce.
other fellow, Henry Luce.
Mhm.
We could talk about him, he's important. And this article was like the first. Huxley wrote The Doors of Perception 10 years earlier or so, but Gordon writes this article in the most popular periodical in the United States, maybe in the world, right? Life magazine, had front page story about this mushrooms that cause visions. And it's really, psychedelic historians note this as like the big thing, like suddenly this mushroom that's known only to anthropologists and a handful of people, esoteric bohemian stuff, suddenly it's big news. And this is the thing that kind of started, one of the major events that started the psychedelic era.
Mhm.
And what I found out that was shocking, first of all, it's shocking enough that it was a Wall Street banker that starts this kind of counterculture thing.
Mhm.
But it becomes even more shocking when you realize that this expedition and the publication of the expedition was funded by the CIA. Now, Wasson has a little cover story. You may know, and your listeners can find out, that Wasson was a very private fellow, but he only gave a few interviews in his life. And one of them was to me at the end of his life. And I conducted a very thorough interview of his career. And it's published in my first book. It's published on my website, alteredstatesofamerica.net. Maybe we'll get to that.
Mhm.
But Wasson tells this cover story that, see, the CIA had started this project called MK Ultra, which we'll talk about. A lot of things to talk about here, Noah. And he says that the CIA wanted to go on this trip with him. And first he said no. And then the CIA went around and came up with an agent disguised as a chemistry professor from the University of Delaware. And he said, I've got a foundation. I'm interested in these mushrooms too. And if you let me come, I can pay for the trip. And so Wasson, even though he was wealthy, said, okay, fantastic. And that, but this is a guy named James Moore, and he was a CIA operative. But this is a cover story. We've since found the documents that Wasson was fully aware of this. And that the important point is that the CIA, this Mexico expedition was called MK Ultra Subproject number 58. So now we have to think, well, wait a second here. Here's the CIA, which has only been around for 10 years at this point. Its charter expressly forbids it from operating on American soil. It was set up to be an intelligence gathering apparatus operating overseas to protect us from those bad Russians. But here is an instance where they are secretly funding an expedition to this indigenous society to publicize their religion and popularize it, profane it, really is what happens. And instigate this tremendous movement in America. Why are they doing that? Why are they doing that? You know, that's been a question that began to kind of, you know, obsess me for many years, and still kind of does, because you know, there's just a lot of material there that we need to really look at. Why is the CIA starting the psychedelic movement secretly?
Yeah.
Why are they putting this drug out there?
Yeah, I've become quite obsessed with that question myself too. So I understand that. Your book, jumping around a little bit, you know, to some of the other figures you talked about, your book, Outside Looking In, you know, the collection of essays about Leary and people that knew him. The most fascinating one to me in there is an inclusion you have about correspondence between Timothy Leary and Aldous Huxley, in which Huxley references working with, at the time, a professor of the University of Oklahoma, I believe, and then later UCLA, by the name of Jolly West, who has, of course, been kind of infamized nowadays by some of the work by Tom O'Neill and his discovery of correspondence between Jolly West and Sidney Gottlieb, who was, you know, one of the architects of MK Ultra. Can you talk to me a little bit about Huxley and Jolly West's, you know, potential relationship and where Leary fits in that equation too?
Yeah, wow, no, you know, you really like zero in
Oh
on
yeah.
One on one of the very key issues. And you know, Jolly West has passed away now, of course. So you mentioned the O'Neill book, which is an
Yes.
extremely important, fairly new book to come out, in which it took him 25 years to write. And I can understand that, because you're dealing with forces here that first of all, you know, the CIA is a very powerful organization, and their mind control operation is very effective. So putting this stuff out, you know, really marginalizes you. This whole, you know, industry of the weaponization of the term conspiracy theory.
Right.
So you know, Tom O'Neill, who was a journalist, needing journalism for his livelihood, had to be very careful about the kinds of things he was writing about, because it's very easy to lose your job and be cast aside. But O'Neill wrote this very important book showing that Jolly West was part of the cultivation of Charles Manson and the deployment of psychedelic drugs to induce chaos in our culture in the 60s. And Jolly West has other credits, sort of, to his career. One of them being that he was the psychiatrist that was called in to treat Jack Ruby, when Jack Ruby was in prison for killing Lee Harvey Oswald. You know the story that Jack Ruby or Jack Rubenstein is his
Yes.
real name, and he's said to be, have had these underworld connections, and people think, oh, the mafia, but it was a Jewish mafia. And he was instructed to kill Lee Harvey Oswald, and then he was sentenced to a long prison term. And when he was in prison, he kind of like come to Jesus moment, like, hey, I don't want to take the fall for all this. And he started saying that there was this right-wing plot to kill the president, and I don't want, get me out of here. And I will, want to, and so they called in the prison psychiatrist, who was Jolly West, and they diagnosed Jack Ruby as a paranoid schizophrenic or something, and administer antipsychotic medication. And then very soon he's dead from, I don't remember if was fast-acting brain cancer, or it was a heart attack or
Yeah,
something.
and
Yeah.
just a little bit more detail to that interaction with Jolly West. Apparently, what happened was, I think he was supposed to testify. I don't know if it was the Warren Commission or the Church Committee, something like that, where he was supposed to go before, he was supposed to provide testimony, and they were worried he was going to start kind of spilling these beans. So when Jolly West came in, he had a meeting with him. And after this meeting, somehow Jack Ruby came out completely incoherent and rambling and hysterical, basically. And the theory is
Wow.
that Jolly West went in there and gave him some sort of psychedelic that just ruined his brain. And there's even a video on YouTube that you can watch that is after this interaction with Jolly West, and Jack Ruby's talking to reporters and stuff. And you can see in his eyes that he is on something, and the things that he's saying are just crazy, outlandish, talking about man's place in the universe and all this stuff. It's just very obvious that he was drugged
Oh,
in this
well,
moment.
that's fascinating. I'd like to see that. So
I'll send you
send
that
me that
video.
link.
It's
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah. No, I've never seen that. And so, it's, I forgot that I had those Huxley letters in there where Huxley, the Huxley Jolly West link,
Mhm. And he
because,
mentions also working with, sorry to interrupt you, he just mentions
yeah,
working to improve John Lilly's methods, or something like that is in that letter with from
yeah,
Huxley.
yeah. See, Huxley is another one of these characters that, I always knew Jolly West was a bad guy. In fact,
Mhm.
Frank Barron, um, knew Jolly West. Frank has some connections with CIA that are still a little murky to me. And we talked about the CIA a lot. Frank told me that he was, well, in his autobiography, a very important book called No Rootless Flower, Frank talks about graduate school at Berkeley, where he and Tim went to the University of California, Berkeley PhD program at what was called IPAR, Institute of Personality Assessment and Research. And Tim has written essays about this, and Frank gets into this. This is basically, there's so much history. OSS, the World War II intelligence operation of the Allies at the end of the war, disbanded. And part of it went to Harvard and became the Department of Social Relations at Harvard. Part of it went to Washington and became the Central Intelligence Agency. And part of it went to Berkeley at the University of California and became the Institute of Personality Research and Assessment. And it began that's really where the operations of psychological warfare began, in this post-war period, where there was a shift. If you went to high school and college in America, you're given the story that the United States beat Nazi Germany, and then everything was great after that. We were the great heroes, but it's much more complicated than that,
Mhm.
because there were many very powerful factors in the United States, industry and banking and government, that were pro-Nazi. And this will circle back to Wasson too. But Frank wrote in his autobiography, No Rootless Flower, about he and Tim began to realize that they were working for the CIA, and that they had just fought a war against totalitarianism. But here these
Mhm.
were, government funds coming into these eager psychologists at Berkeley who were, asked to design tests so they could, predict and control human behavior, basically. Tim writes a very important chapter in his book, The Intelligence Agents. And I think that chapter is called The Federal Bureaucracy. I really should put that on my website too. But nobody cared. Nobody really cared because, you know, they still like this idea of American, we're the greatest, American exceptionalism. We beat the Nazis. We're the beacon of freedom and democracy in the world. Getting offered money from the government was very flattering.
Mhm.
And so this was happening. But so Frank, Jolly West, Frank then, after Berkeley to Harvard, he had a period of time at the University of Minnesota when Jolly West was there, and they knew each other. And I really would like to explore in what way did they know each other. But Frank, who was one of the kindest, very introverted, shy, super brilliant guy. I loved him like a father. He spoke very frankly to me, I thought. But he said to me that Jolly West was one of the few people in the world that he knew that he could just say was unequivocally evil. So that always kind of stuck in my mind as I advanced through this career. And I don't know, I'm thinking of telling a kind of funny story.
Please, yeah.
About one time that I confronted Jolly West in public.
Wow.
And it was in October of 1993. And I was a director of what was called the Albert Hofmann Foundation. A group had gathered in Los Angeles to try to create an archive and library of psychedelic material. And Albert Hofmann asked me if I would be a director of it. And so I commuted to LA. I was there a lot. That's a whole other story. But anyway, that fall, October 93, there was a symposium at UCLA, the UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute, where Jolly West was like a very prominent figure. And so they had a symposium. This was the 50th anniversary of LSD. And so they had this symposium like commemorating hallucinogens, and it was very psychiatric, like what have we learned in psychiatry about these drugs. And Jolly West was this big fat guy, was presiding over this in-house conference of all these psychiatrists and interns and medical students. And it was a very boring symposium, but he came out at the end and he said, just kind of dismissed. He said, LSD, there were a lot of us very excited about it, in the 60s and 50s, and talked a little bit about the psychiatric stuff with serotonin. And then he said, but then Timothy Leary got involved, and we all saw what a burnout he became. And we realized that psychedelic drugs didn't have much to teach us anymore, and just kind of, and then he started to, that was it. And he started to walk off the stage. Well, I was in the audience with Oscar Janiger, who was this very famous Beverly Hills shrink. He wasn't really a shrink. He was really an osteopath, but somehow got an MD and was a psychiatrist, but didn't really have the training, and was the guy who gave LSD to a lot of Hollywood celebrities. He was also a guy that was treated. I lived at his house. He treated me like his grandson.
He treated Cary Grant, right? Was that one of his
well,
patients?
He was part of the group. Yeah, I actually read Cary Grant's handwritten session reports, and Jack Nicholson, and lots of famous people. And but Oz, I called him, was so I was interested in the effects of drugs. And so Oz would prescribe things to me. And I was also, like I said, a golfer, and I was interested in the performance enhancing properties of drugs, a whole range of drugs, like, Dexedrine or Ritalin or Prozac. So Oz would write me these prescriptions, and I would, just like experiment with these drugs for a period of, a few weeks or months. But So anyway, this symposium, I was in the middle of my Prozac experiment. And you may know that Prozac sometimes kind of makes you, I was sort of unchecked,
Mhm.
and I would, anyway, I'm usually very shy, but after Jolly West said this about Timothy Leary, who at this point had become my friend, and I really admired him, and just calling him a burned out guy when, although there were aspects of that, I loved the guy. It was very insulting. So I stood up from the back of this auditorium as Jolly West is walking off the stage. And I said, well, you take questions now? And the whole audience kind of turned around and looked at me because, you know, this is medical school. And it's like Jolly West ran the place. And these doctors are so, you know, thirsty for their careers. They would never question authority. But I just stood up and I said, will you take questions now? And he kind of looked at me. He was no longer behind the podium. And he was just like right in the middle of the stage, trying to get off the stage. And I said, questions now? And I said, you know, since you meant, and I knew all this stuff that we talked about Jolly West being, killing Jack Ruby and lots of other things with MK Ultra. You know, if you read the very important book, I'm sure you have, Acid Dreams,
Yes.
very important book by my friend Martin Lee. Jolly West did lots of really nasty shit with acid, and this is, you know, he doesn't even get into this stuff with Manson, but just like, you know, loading people up and killing elephants and crazy shit. And I said, since you mentioned getting burned out on LSD, I wonder if you could say something about the LSD research that you did for the CIA. And he looked at me like, who the fuck are you? And this is the funny thing. So he's trying to walk off the stage, and he's standing there, and all of a sudden he just goes like this. He puts his hands like right over his balls. Body language just cracked me up. And then he just tried to deny that he worked for the CIA. You know, he had some platitude like, well, you know, the Russians were experimenting with psychedelic drugs, so we had to do it. You know, it was totally defensive. And, you know, in spite of those reports, I never had anything to do with that. And it was just, it was a hilarious thing. I can't believe I did it. You know, I confronted this cold-blooded killer right in public, and Oz took me off of Prozac right after that episode.
That is a fantastic story. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. I have not heard that in any of your other interviews.
Yeah.
But yeah, Jolly West is really fascinating to me. He's become kind of this, you know, villain archetype at this point. And I mean, there's so many, the stretch of people that he was involved with is so crazy, you know, from Jack Ruby, Sirhan, rumored Timothy
Yeah,
McVeigh.
tell me about tell me about Sirhan, because I saw that recently and
Yeah.
I don't actually know that
I
connection.
don't know it may be in the same vein as the Timothy McVeigh ones, that there's not any really definitive things. I just know that there were links there. And with Timothy McVeigh, I had Tom O'Neill on the podcast, and he gave a really
Um,
interesting story about how he was when he was originally trying to get some, you know, information from the FBI about Manson and Jolly West. It was around the same time that the Oklahoma City bombing happened. And he was the person who worked at the FBI that he was corresponding with was Chandra Levy, who, you know, famously was murdered, and her body was found in Rock Creek Park in DC. And there was this whole affair thing. Well, there's a lot more to it apparently, but some people think that she was killed to keep information about McVeigh and Manson's connections with Jolly West from coming to public light. But I mean, there are so many rumors about him. I've heard rumors that he was Kanye West's mom's doctor in the 90s. And actually, when Kanye West was hospitalized in 2016, you know, kind of forcibly hospitalized, he was taken to the hospital at UCLA where Jolly West, you know, worked and spent most of his tenure as a professor there. So, I mean, or not professor, psychologist, I guess, but Jolly, he's just,
no,
you
he's
know,
a
pretty
professor,
okay.
Jolly West.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure he was an MD psychiatrist at the Neuropsychiatric Institute, and a professor and researcher there.
Another little thing about him that I wanted to bring up, you know, when you're having conversations about psychedelics and their kind of history, and that, you know, occult or hidden side of it that you talk about, people get really, offended, and they take up arms about it because, it's kind of this sacred cow, and it's become so popularized, and a lot of people have built their identities around it. And whether it's true or, I'm not saying that they can't provide, psychological, positive insights or things like that. I totally believe they have the capacity for that. But people do oftentimes get very, defensive when you're talking about this aspect of it. And one of the things that is brought up a lot, I think, to delegitimize these types of theories and this, line of questioning is that if the government wanted these drugs to be consumed en masse so badly, why were they made illegal and remain that way?
Okay, that's a great question. And one of the things that have written about, I haven't published this book that I'm working on,
Mhm.
that my book is called Altered States of America, Psychedelic Movements of the 20th and 21st Century. And there are certain myths that we have to expose. And one of the first ones, you just mentioned it. If you think that the government makes drugs illegal to stop people from using them, you're being tricked,
Mhm.
and you don't understand the history. That's not why drugs are illegal. The
Mhm.
government is not trying to protect the public health. Drugs are illegal because that way they're more expensive, and their commerce is controlled by hidden forces that are aligned with the government. And so that's a conspiracy theory. And if you're allergic to conspiracy theories, if you're one of these people that has been put to sleep by this propaganda campaign to disparage conspiracy theorists, you're not going to understand this stuff. But if you're a social scientist or an attorney, then you know that this is how you do this research. You come up with theories, and then you find evidence and you support them. And there are good conspiracy theories and there are bad conspiracy theories. And so back to drugs, if I was teaching a course on this, or when I talk about this, I recommend that people first take a look at a very important book called The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia by Alfred McCoy, who started that book as his PhD dissertation in history at Yale, and then became a book and a very esteemed long career as a professor at the University of Wisconsin, an impeccable researcher. And The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia is an expose about just that the history of the heroin problem in the United States. Just in broad strokes, blacks had gone to fight for the Allies in World War II, and then when they came back from the war, they were really kind of empowered with patriotism and political action, and began to move back into their inner cities and started organizing politically to try to redress some of the problems that they faced with racism and social injustice and all that. And this was a threat to the power structure. And so suddenly there was like this flood of heroin that started coming into the cities. And McCoy researches all this, and the Vietnam, we move a few years further into the Vietnam War and the Golden Triangle there, and the whole conspiracy. And it's not a bad word. That's just how you understand what the fuck is going on. And so that's one very important book that shows the template for this method of using drugs, billions of dollars. Heroin is cheap, but when it's illegal, it's very expensive and it's very addicting. And so you'll do anything to get it, and it caused all this, unrest, and it, disintegrated the social movements, and was one of the main reasons for the Vietnam War. There's a whole long history of this kind of stuff that is shown by really good researchers. A book I like to recommend in this context is also John Potash's book, drugs as weapons against us,
Yep.
which shows the whole history of how drugs are used by oligarchs, going way back into history to subdue populations, make tremendous amount of money for black ops, and maintain the power structure. The founders of Yale University and Harvard University were opium traffickers. This goes back to the opium wars. There's a whole history here. There's a researcher up in Canada named Cynthia Chung, Chun, that has been writing about this lately, the history of heroin and the Vatican, and it gives a new level of meaning to the Marxist cliche, religion is the opium of the masses, because they really use opium. So there's that. And then more recently, Gary Webb, who was a journalist, I think he started in San Jose, began to research the crack cocaine epidemic as it was happening starting in South Central Los Angeles, and started to realize this is a CIA operation.
He
Same
paid
thing.
very dearly for looking into that as well.
Right. He committed suicide by shooting himself twice in the head.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so that question that, when governments make drugs illegal, their use skyrockets. And we saw this very clearly. This same thing is the case with psychedelic drugs. When they made LSD illegal, and I have some friends in law that say, you can't say that a drug is illegal, but let's just leave that aside for now. But when psychedelic drugs became scheduled and forbidden, it didn't stop their use. Their use went up. We saw it very, very clearly also with MDMA, which is a topic that I've been very involved with. MDMA was like a secret substance being used carefully by people produced in independent labs like my own, and used as a very effective adjunct to psychotherapy and spiritual growth and insight. And then when it became popularized and made illegal, it suddenly became like the most popular recreational drug in the world for many, many decades, and made billions and billions and billions of dollars for organized crime. And the DEA, there have been articles published that most of that ecstasy trade, the global ecstasy trade, is an Israeli organized crime thing with connections to Israeli intelligence. And so the drug laws don't stop people from using drugs. It actually promotes the use of drugs and controls the commerce, and it ensures. I want to get back to something that you said before about I still know and that psychedelic drugs are extremely valuable extremely valuable tools for expanding consciousness and for opening the heart. And when they're used with the right intention and setting, they're some of the most powerful and wonderful experiences. These experiences can be destructive. If you look at the course of my career, and you look through history, societies that have used these drugs effectively have used them in very controlled situations. They're sacred, and that's a word that's getting really overused a lot in society. But sacred is a really important word, and I like to preserve the meaning of it. It also comes from a word that means separate. They're not. They're very carefully controlled. They're used and they're administered by specially trained people. You don't talk about them in ordinary reality. You don't have advertisements. You don't hang a shingle up. And these sacred substances are being profaned and commodified now in this new renaissance that diminishes their truly transformative potential and their sacred potential. But and this is a, this is a just a thing I have to negotiate as I speak and write more about this stuff, because I've sort of gotten a there are millions of people that are fascinated by these substances, and for good reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm sharing this research into the hidden history, I'm not denying the value of these substances for spiritual growth and psychological healing, transformation, and recreation. And, it's I like to compare it to sex, because sex is one of the most fantastic things that we do as human beings. When you're responsible adults or responsible human beings coming together in that sort of intimacy and communion and sharing. And my teacher, the great historian of religion, Mircea Eliade at the University of Chicago, thought that sexuality was the last vestige of the sacred in the modern world. It gives us that like the highest achievement. We love it, and I love it. Okay, but there's also the sex industry, right? There's human trafficking, there's prostitution, there's rape, there's all these other things that are involved with the bigger subject of sexuality. So when you're critical of rape or the sex industry, you're not critical of sexuality. That's what I'm trying. That's the position I want to make clear with me and psychedelic drugs. These are very, very valuable. They're fantastic. Some of my psychedelic experiences, I completely treasure them.
Yeah.
I'm not against psychedelic drugs. I'm against mind control. I'm against the co-option of them for political agendas that I find abhorrent. And that's why we need to do these podcasts, and a growing number of people are becoming aware of this also. It's to preserve the sacred transformative value of psychedelic drugs, and reject the profane, commodifying political agenda of them, and mind control and profiteering.
Yeah.
Sorry,
That really resonates with me. I couldn't agree more with you on all of what you just said. And before we move away from just that topic of, drugs being illegal and why that, helps the oligarchs, mission with them ultimately, I found a quote by Jolly West that, if you don't mind, I just wanted to read real quick, because I think it's really fascinating and speaks to that, what we were just talking about. But the quote from Jolly West is this. He says, "The role of drugs in the exercise of political control is also coming under increasing discussion. Control can be through prohibition or supply. The total or even partial prohibition of drugs gives the government considerable leverage for other types of control. An example would be selective application of drug laws, permitting immediate search or no-knock entry against selected components of the population, such as members of certain minority groups or political organizations. But a government could also supply drugs to help control a population. This method, foreseen by Aldous Huxley in Brave New World, has the governing element employing drugs selectively to manipulate the governed in various ways. To a large extent, the numerous rural and urban communes, which provide a great freedom for private drug use and where hallucinogens are widely used today, are actually subsidized by our society. Their perpetuation is aided by the parental or other family remittances, welfare, and unemployment payments, and benign neglect by the police. In fact, it may be more convenient and perhaps even more economical to keep the growing number of chronic drug users fairly isolated and also out of the labor market with its millions of unemployed. To society, the communards with their hallucinogenic drugs are probably less bothersome and less expensive if they are living apart than if they are engaging in alternative modes of expressing their alienation, such as active, organized, vigorous political protest and dissent." So that just really spelled it out.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And I know that quote. This is one of the things that I lost in the fire. I mean, I had all these books with notes and stuff, and you'll have to remind me where you got that. That's,
yeah, I will.
Was it in that Abramson book on LSD?
I believe I first saw that quote actually in something that Joe Atwill had worked on.
Yeah.
I think that's where I saw it the first time. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I know I've seen it multiple places.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great quote. I know the audacity of these people. It's like they hide their operation in plain sight. He mentions Brave New World in there. That's a super important part of this whole story, that when we were all kind of forced to read Brave New World when we were kids in high school,
Yeah.
We thought it was that Huxley was issuing a warning
Warning us. Yeah.
that this is what society could be like unless we're careful. But no, Huxley was one of these British elitists himself. It was a blueprint. And then I still thought of Huxley as a humanist for quite a while until I began getting into these other aspects of it. And since we mentioned Huxley and Brave New World, we have to also mention that Brave New World Revisited.
Yes.
So Huxley writes this novel back in 1938, which is about, the future that he says is 600 years from now. But then just 20 years later, he writes Brave New World Revisited, nonfiction essay, where again, he just lays it out. He says, this is what they're doing. Doesn't say this is what we're doing, but he's one of these guys,
Yeah.
And LSD is the new soma, and this is what the world controllers, how they're going to suppress dissent for all these distractions and the psychedelic drugs, and he just lays it right out and like very honestly.
Nobody wants to talk about Revisited, but I think it's just as important as the book itself because it's so overt in, just saying what they're doing. And I always found it crazy that Huxley is put on this pedestal as kind of a counterculture hero when his family was part of the oligarchy. They were as establishment as they come. His brother Julian Huxley, I think, is credited with coining the term transhumanism. So their family was very much invested in establishing and maintaining this, control through their methods of social engineering that, Aldous was writing about and showing us.
Yeah. Eugenics, right? His
yes.
brother or something. Yeah.
Yep.
So I just came from in Brave New World, Huxley talks about soma festivals, right? So when people in the future become restless politically, and they were like, how come those guys got all the money and big houses and and we got to live in these little rooms and work all the time? We got to do something about this. Then you are pronounced with a condition. They don't call it PTSD, but that's another thing maybe we'll get into. But you're ordered to go on
Soma holiday.
It's called a soma holiday, where you go to these places and you're given this drug, and this drug makes you feel like everything is okay, and you fuck your brains out. You don't establish intimate relationships. It's a trivialization of sexuality, just like the psychedelic drug is a trivialization of something that can be very profound. And then you take drugs and sex and drugs all weekend, and then you come back and okay, maybe it's not so bad, right? That's the political effect. Well, I just came from a soma holiday myself. I went to something that's called the Medicine Festival in outside of London, on this just beautiful, like 1,000-acre estate of British land barons. And it was like this marvelous celebration of peace and all these just beautiful, hippies and great food and all these workshops and, dealing with your trauma and all like self stuff. But there was no political stuff, no activism. It was all just about feeling good. And then I realized later that the people that owned this land, the family that owned this land, these very rich oligarchic families, went to Eton, where Huxley and the Huxley George Orwell tradition. And I realized that's what this is. This is and Burning Man is another example of this. And you probably know, since that fantastic quote that you read of Jolly West, the famous quotation that John Barlow issued. Do you know this one?
I'm pretty sure. John Perry Barlow. I don't know if I know the exact quote, but let me hear it.
John Perry Barlow said something like, he was writing about Burning Man, And he said, if Karl Rove wanted to come up with a, plan to distract people from, voter registration, he could do no better than Burning Man, where people come from all over the world and take these copious amounts of, he comes up with a new word for psychedelics. I think he calls them confusicants. He calls psychedelic drugs confusicants, which is, again, Barlow. That's another guy. I knew him quite well.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the, Burning Man is another, you mentioned Joe Atwill, and he's done some good programs on this with, what's his name?
Jan
Anyway.
Irvin.
Well, Jan, yes, but another guy, they did these together, and I was on there a couple of times.
Okay.
Joe Atwill is one of the really, really important researchers in this field, and he's become a very close friend of mine. And I was introduced to him through Jan Irwin, who approached me many years before. And it's funny because Jan, just because he came up, made some comments on Facebook today, and I just want to put this out. I don't know if he listens or if you know him or anything, but he is, he approached me. He's a very bad reputation amongst some of us in this field because he is so angry and kind of self-centered and just has this edge. He approached me way back, like almost 20 years ago in like the early 2000s, 2005, I don't know exactly, but he had broken through, and he'd been working with Joe Atwill, and he realized some of this stuff about Wasson before I did, around the same time. And he read my book, and he wanted to connect with me, but he was so angry and so hard to talk with that I kind of kept him away. And then he sent me one of his books on the mushroom that he wrote about the whole situation with John Allegro, which is another important part of this. And the book was I read it, and it was so good, really excellent, that I began to share information with him and develop a relationship with him. And then he just like turned and became like he thought that I was like, because I knew all these guys. I knew everybody, all these guys that he is like positive were operating MK Ultra. The schools that the CIA has infiltrated. I went to a lot of the University of Chicago, University of California. I was close with Frank Barron, Timothy Leary, all these people, Albert Hofmann, Wasson. And he just kind of got very, very difficult and very so I had to try to, I want to honor him for his courage and for some of his very tenacious research, but I also I wish I could help him be more polite, because I kind of see him, he's taken a lot of psychedelic drugs. He's kind of a victim of the op that he wants to expose. Anyway, that's a complicated story, but
I heard that he had I don't know if this is true or not, but I heard that there was a DMT experience that kind of broke him, and maybe is the cause for some of this, anger that you're talking about. But yeah, I've heard those things too. Well, I told you that. Yeah, no, go ahead. Sorry.
Tell me a little bit more about yourself, because I'm super impressed with your clarity and your knowledge base.
Thank you.
And I like to understand more, like, what makes you different from the people who we offend with our conspiracy theories.
Well, I was one of those. I was kind of one of those people, I would say, without getting too personal into all of it, but I was introduced to this kind of, psychedelia and those types of things and behaviors at a pretty young age. And, when I was young, when I was in high school, my heroes were Hunter Thompson and Tim Leary and people like that. And the music that I listened to all, reinforced that type of behavior and interest and stuff. So I spent most of my childhood and some of my young adult life, very engrossed in that lifestyle and worldview. And was very interested in, psychedelics and esoteric things spent a lot of years that I don't really look at as wasted years, they were formative, absolutely. But it was, in my 20s that I started to be interested in the people kind of behind the scenes and the machinations that brought these bands or these individuals or books or whatever it is, into popular culture. So that was really my kind of awakening when I don't know if you're familiar with Dave McGowan's work in on like Laurel Canyon, but that was a
Yeah.
super eye-opening moment for me to realize that not only why it would make so much sense for the powers that be to utilize things like popular culture, music, film, literature as a weapon against us, you know, but also that what those behaviors and things really represent, which is neutralizing my political or social importance, a person who is perpetually taking psychedelic drugs and going to music festivals and things, they have no organizational capacity. They have no ability to affect true change in the world. And when you think back to every generation of youth culture since the 60s and pretty much onward has been hijacked and neutralized in that way, there hasn't been a true political revolution in, 60 years, 70 years, whatever it is. And it's just so obvious to me that that's the reason why I think that MK Ultra was so successful beyond anyone's wildest comprehension. And it goes on today another way, I know Leary famously said that the internet would be the LSD of the next generation. And you look around and see that so much of the mind control is perpetuated through technology and internet and apps and whatever it is, social media, different things like that. But just I've been so fascinated by the history of all of it for so long, Um, and a lot of it is just because I was kind of a victim to it myself when I was younger. And another thing that happened to me when I was younger was in midway through high school, I was sent to one of the wilderness therapy programs. I'm sure
Mhm.
you've heard of those.
Yeah,
And
Outward Bound or something.
yeah, looking back, in retrospect, I realized that some of the things that were being taught to me and done to me then were, kind of, they were kind of fell under that rubric of mind control.
Hmm.
Um, and even the combination of that with psychedelics and things of that nature, going through sweat lodge ceremonies and different methods of isolation that they used in these camps, being dropped out in the middle of nowhere by yourself for this thing that they're kind of building you up the whole experience for this solo trip where they leave you isolated in the woods for a couple of days. Um, Even to some other stranger things that I experienced there with one of the psychologists that worked with me and some ideas that she kind of put in my head looking back on and just wondering, why they would have done that. So it comes from
Mhm.
a lot of different things. The answer to your question is just kind of
Mhm.
simply that I was a victim to some of these things, and I find it probably the most important thing in the world to wake people up to the ways that they are being manipulated and not realizing, that famous Huxley quote where he says, something about the a prisoner who's unaware of his
Mhm.
prison.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
yeah, yeah.
Mhm. Fascinating. So I'm curious also about what year were you born?
1992.
92.
I'm
Okay.
32.
32. Um, how old were, because I'm wondering in my own life. I'm not an astrologer, but I'm sort of fascinated by cosmic cycles and shifts in my own life. And so I was born in 56. I'm 67 years old. It's so hard to believe, but I am. That I was laughing the other day because when I was doing my research with MDMA,
Mhm.
and I knew that it stimulated the heart, not just heart chakra, but the organ. And if you were 70 years old, I wouldn't give it to you. Now I'm almost 70 myself. But so astrologers talk about this, the Saturn return.
I was going to go there actually. Yeah.
Okay, so I first got, I really, my dive deepened at my first Saturn return in my late 20s.
Mhm.
And I was involved in all this stuff, and then things started to change. But it was really at my second Saturn return when I started to, like, all of a sudden, like, whoa, I have a whole different message now, a whole nother layer to it. Does that correspond to your
It was
path?
a few months after my 27th birthday. Yeah, actually.
That you began to go,
Yes,
oh, this is what's happening. Yeah, it's
correct. Yep.
interesting. Yeah. So
Yeah,
I'm gonna
very
get some more
interesting.
astrology. Yeah.
Well, I told you I was going to ask you some questions that you've never been asked. So
Mhm.
I plan to follow through on that promise.
Yeah.
But I've got some questions. Being a musician myself, this podcast is kind of a side project of my musical project, so music comes up a lot in what I'm interested in, especially in this area of, social engineering and stuff. Like I told you, McGowan's work about Laurel Canyon, opened up a whole new world to me to, really think about things from a different perspective. But when I was a kid, and I still enjoy some of these bands too, but some of the, when you look back to high school and things like that, I think music is the main method of, I mean, when you think back to like high school and stuff, the different cliques and groups of people is really determined by the music they listen to. You have
Right.
punks and goths and hip hop heads and metal heads and whatever it is. It's very defined by musical genres. Um, so when I was
I
young,
I was I just want to slip in this
yeah,
morning. I feel that too. And when you mentioned McGowan's work, I have that's another, it causes a lot of cognitive dissonance
mhm,
because that first wave of music in the 60s that inspired me and woke up my heart and love. And I play
right,
guitar and I love singing these songs. And my wife is away for a couple of days, and so I like to have the music in the morning kind of blaring, and I've got Crosby, Stills, and Nash playing, and I'm thinking about McGowan. I think McGowan, anyway, this is another
mhm,
thing that we're saying, like sex and drugs and music are, some of the most wonderful, opening, expansive, unifying, beautiful things of our life. And they're also weaponized. And
yes.
so this is what we're talking about, like how do we cultivate this
Mhm.
discernment that's necessary so please go on.
Yeah, no, thank you. And for anybody unfamiliar with McGowan's work, which at this point you should not be, please go read his books. But, the central premise of the one we're talking about is that most of the bands from the 60s and 70s, especially coming out of the Laurel Canyon, LA kind of scene that were the most popular, most of them were products of career military intelligence families and families that were very established, within that milieu, whether it's Frank Zappa, whose dad worked at Edgewood Arsenal, a facility implicated in MK Ultra, or Jim Morrison, his, Navy admiral father who was involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident, that people should definitely educate themselves on that. But that's kind of what we're talking about here. And I'm just talking about, I have a couple questions for you about two specific individuals that I think you might have come across in the 90s and when you were working with Timothy Leary. A hugely influential and psychedelic band from my generation and still to this day is a band called Tool. Um, and this band has always had themes of the esoteric and psychedelic, in their early album liners, they have medical dissertations on ketamine use and stuff from like the early 90s. And it actually just so happens to turn out that their guitarist, his first wife was a woman named Camilla Grace, who worked for Timothy Leary in the early
i
90s.
knew I knew Camilla.
She worked as
I
an
knew her.
archivist for him, correct? And kind of transcribing his works to a digital platform.
Go on. When you have a question, I'll say what
Yeah.
I can say.
Well, I'm just setting that up because it's interesting to me because the band, as beloved as they do fall in this category of it makes a lot of sense if they were kind of used or, kind of weaponized to introduce the youth culture of that time to psychedelics, and some of the more occult things. They're very avid about they don't hide their interest in, Aleister Crowley and things of that nature. So this band falls very much within that category of the Laurel Canyon bands that McGowan talks about. And it's pretty obvious to me that maybe they had something to do with that. Not only was Adam Jones, the guitarist, married to a woman that worked directly for Timothy Leary, but Leary introduced many of their concerts. They talk about in their old website blog, they talk about using ketamine at his house and like all this crazy experimentation. So my question is, did you know Camilla? Do you know anything about the band? And, just kind of, what can you tell me?
I can't tell you anything that much because I never tuned into that. I'm older.
Mhm.
My musical tastes were earlier. I was in like the Beatles, Dead, Crosby, Stills, Nash, Dylan, more, folk rock sort of stuff. The
Yeah.
the the later waves of things. That's a generation kind of younger than me.
Mhm.
When I knew Camilla. Um, just because she was very close with Tim. Um, she was on the team, the family that was helping him die. Um, she was a total sweetheart, a fantastically beautiful, angelic person. I'll never forget when I first met her. I stayed over. I woke up in the morning. I actually slept outside on the on the sensory isolation thing, and I just opened my eyes and her face was like right next to me like this. She's just like a Botticelli angel. And we were sort of friends, and I knew that she was in the music scene. I thought at the time she was Sean Lennon's girlfriend.
She was
And
before. Yeah.
yeah, and you know so I wasn't really that into this aspect of that. Then you'll notice, like in my book on Tim, I don't mention the CIA at all. I don't
Hmm.
mention McGowan. I didn't get into that. Tim didn't. I wasn't. This was for me. That was like early '90s or kind of mid '90s when I
Hmm.
was doing that book, and I really wasn't that tuned into it. I
Hmm.
was still mostly interested in trying to carve a place in religious studies for psychedelic drugs, and I wanted to honor Tim for um, parts of his very hectic and chaotic life,
Yeah.
and like an apology for Timothy Leary, not a wholehearted endorsement of him. And he was a very charming and super intelligent and flawed and wounded man. And he had lots of different aspects. And I'm in this position because I find myself defending him a lot against the way he's marginalized in this current renaissance.
Right.
But what I appreciate about him is his anti-authoritarianism. Like he had this dance with Crowley too, and that whole thing, that to me personally, that's just abhorrent.
Hmm.
And I've had some friends who have tried to turn me on to Tool and say, listen to this, but the vibe for me is just like, I don't like, that's not when
Hmm.
I don't want to go there.
Hmm.
So there were other people that were involved. We would come by Tim's Perry Farrell, who was,
Hmm.
but that wasn't that's more your generation, and you're gonna teach me about that. Um, I don't. I only knew her, personally as friends, and we were helping Tim die.
Hmm. Hmm.
Like I have um, one very, very, very sweet, a lot of sweet memories and things that happened during that like couple year period as Tim was going through his death dance. But I'll never forget this one. Let me tell you this story, and then maybe we can continue. But let me just tell you the story.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's very near the end of Tim's life. He'll be dead in like 3 days, and nobody's home, just me and Tim and Camilla, and Tim decides to go to a Catholic mass. Like, so Tim is very good friends with Bob Guccione Jr., who is the son of the founder of Penthouse magazine.
Okay.
It's kind of, girly magazine.
Hmm.
And Bob Guccione Jr. has become a avowed Catholic, like a hardcore Catholic. And he's trying to get Tim to, confess and go. Tim, who was raised Catholic and like hated the Catholic Church, agrees to go to church. And so he gets dressed up in this tuxedo and all spiffed out. Guccione's big limousine comes over to the house. And I'm saying to Tim, like, what the fuck are you doing? Like, what? And he just, he's like a little boyish and, he just kind of goes, you never know. So he goes to church. He comes back like 2 hours later and he's in a wheelchair, and they wheel him into the wheelchair and it's just he and I. Camilla's in the back of the house. And he comes over and he's like all disheveled. His tie is open, his shirt is open, his hair is like all messed up. He's light smoking a cigarette. And I said, so how was it, Tim? And he says, oh, those fucking Catholics, they're always telling you what to do. You got to stand up, sit down, kneel, and all this. And it was just funny. Okay, but here's the part that was very moving. We're hanging out at the kitchen table, and Tim starts nodding off. Can't stay awake. And he's afraid to go to sleep because he's afraid he's not going to wake up. He knows he's like right on the edge.
Mm-hmm.
And he tries to stand up and he's like kind of leaning up and like supporting himself on the table and nodding off. And I'm saying, Tim, it's all right. Just relax, go to sleep. You'll be all right. And he's like saying, no, I'm just trying to see if I can sleep standing up. And then it's like he's having a visitation. He's hearing voices. And he starts talking to these voices, and he's there, and he's like kind of like pleading with these voices. I did a good job. I did a good job. And this thing, and I just kind of had this sense. I would have this sense with him other times. Like he was very complicated. Like there were sometimes he would appear like he was the most illuminated man. He had an aura. You could feel this light around him. And he was beautiful and lucid and cracking jokes. And he was like this sparkly Zen master. But there were other times he would shift and morph, and he would look like he was this pain, tormented, twisted, angry, psychotic man. And you could kind of see these, like he was possessed of these different spirits. And you could see him like still like doing this. So I think of his life and, the role he played in history, and we don't understand it. And anyway, as he's doing this, like saying, I did it. And then Camilla, and I don't know if you've ever seen her, but she's just like an angel. She's so beautiful, these blue eyes and this blonde curly hair. And she just came out of the back room and she just, like comforted Tim and got him in his wheelchair and wheeled him away. And he went to sleep. And, he died two or 3 days later.
Wow.
Very cool moment. Thanks for mentioning her. I forgot. I hadn't thought about her for a long time.
That's a really beautiful story. Wow.
So it's like it's a complicated mosaic of
Hmm.
of things and people and demonic shit and illuminated shit and people. We still haven't really figured it out. These things
Mhm.
are kind of mixed up. And that's what we're trying to do is to
Yeah.
understand.
It's kind of a microcosmic example of just, the whole universe and that dichotomy of good and evil, kind of both having to exist. Without the other one, one doesn't really exist, But that's a really beautiful story. Thanks for sharing that. I wish I could have met Tim. I've always wished I could have met him, but it's really interesting to hear that perspective coming from someone who knew him so close.
Yeah, I knew him well. And again, back to Frank Barron,
Mhm.
Frank kind of started him. And Frank and I were, I knew Tim since 1981 was when I first met him.
Mhm.
But for the first few years, as I was going along this path, I sort of bought the story that he blew it. He made psychedelics so controversial that the research was shut down.
Hmm.
And he was kind of a nemesis because I was like, I was a graduate student. I wanted to do research, and there was the ghost of Timothy Leary.
Hmm.
And then as for a few more years and started to learn some of this other stuff. Now he didn't, he freed, and he said this, he's made a lot of clear statements about, he thought that his greatest achievement was wrestling the drugs away from the CIA.
Wow.
He learned he was being used by the CIA
Hmm.
in about 63, and he loved the drugs, he loved the fame, he loved the excitement, he loved the revolutionary potential of them. The CIA was using them to mind control. Tim wanted to use them to excite, a revolution, an internal and political revolution. And so he just, popularized them with different memes, and he really fucked up the MK Ultra operation.
Hmm.
He kind of went in and out of the CIA. It's a very complicated story. It's nowhere near as simple as with these, twits like Michael Pollan put out. Like,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah. If you have just a couple more minutes, there were a
Of
few
course, I
other
do.
characters I just wanted to, we're kind of a
Yeah.
conspiracy related podcast. So some of these things, are you provide a unique perspective to. So within the same, well, you mentioned Perry Farrell of Jane's Addiction, who that band is another interesting, kind of fits into that MK Ultra, Laurel Canyon. There's behind the scenes kind of videos that they put out with Perry talking to his rabbi about kind of the purpose of the band, almost using to elevate this consciousness of the youth and turn away or kind of learn more about their sexuality. And it's really interesting the things that he, the way he phrases things, in these conversations with his rabbi about talking about, needing to change the trajectory of the youth and their sexuality and things like that. So he's just another really interesting figure, that I had overlap with Timothy Leary.
Yeah.
But
So I never met Perry. He was over a lot. I think he was involved with Winona Ryder, maybe.
that's another
He was
that
there a lot.
that leads into
Yeah.
another one I wanted to ask you about. Yeah.
Yeah. So again, I wasn't really that aware, and because I wasn't that aware, couldn't be critical of
Hmm.
I just knew that it was weird for me because I'm into the psychedelic community, as I said at the beginning, is so many different characters in it.
Hmm.
And for me, it was like my most powerful experiences were in nature with plant medicines and the earth and like political realities. But there's this whole other, I call my book Psychedelic Movements
Yeah.
of the 20th and 21st century, because there's one group of drugs, but people using them in very different ways. Then there's this whole, software and computer world and this transhuman stuff. And, I could never relate to those people. They'd all be over there at the house. There'd be someone like Ralph Metzner, who
Hmm.
was a guy that I really connected with, and he and I were more of the same mentality, nature, spirits, and grounded in mental health. And then there was this other group that was just like the more outrageous and chaotic and
Rock and roll.
transhumanistic you could be, and
Hmm.
so I just kind of went the other way. As but I'm very interested to learn from you about that. What continuations of Dave McGowan's
Yeah.
theory you see in this later wave of music?
Well, I just view that, music as kind of almost this arm of the government. It's not all music, obviously, but many of these bands were, a lot of these bands I'm talking about were my introduction to things, of a psychedelic nature, and, kind of planted a seed of curiosity in me that I think in a vacuum of those influences, I probably wouldn't have been predisposed to have an interest in. Another one of those bands is a band called Ministry, and their lead singer, Al Jorgensen. I was able to spend some time talking to him a couple years ago, and he told me that he lived with Timothy Leary. And just background, this is another band that, heavily promoted drug use, not even just psychedelics. He was like a very famous heroin addict, and, just kind of promoting lifestyles like that. So he told me when we were speaking in person that he lived with Timothy Leary for maybe a year or two in the early 90s, and that him and Tim had struck up a relationship because Al had, or a friendship, because Al was willing to use any drug that Tim had, and he was willing to use them intravenously also. So he said that during this time he lived with Leary, he was pretty much being used as a guinea pig, and he would take any drugs that they would have couriers coming around, kind of CIA type men or people bringing drugs. He said even some straight from Sandoz laboratories, and that he would be filmed during these experiments, and Tim would take notes and study his reactions and stuff. And he also said that the videotapes of this experimentation that he underwent is owned by Winona Ryder's father, who, I know that Tim was her godfather, and her father had some sort of a friendship with Leary, maybe also worked as an archivist kind of thing. But their family history is interesting too, because I believe they lived on like a commune around the redwood forest, and it kind of reminded me of, not like the Manson family or Children of God cult, all these different communal things that were going on and had an overlap with the intelligence circles and, psychedelics. But I didn't know if you ever met this guy, Al Jorgensen, or knew about, Winona Ryder's dad, and just all this strange overlap within, pop culture and the intelligence circles.
Okay, well, Winona's parents are old friends of mine. When I was first getting interested in this subject back in the early 1980s, I met them. They're, I guess they're like 10 years older than me, maybe. But Michael Horowitz and Cindy Palmer,
Mhm.
and they were we just connected, and they were friends. And Michael and I felt a real brotherly relationship with Michael for a long time, as we because I was coming at Tim and the psychedelic thing from where I was coming from, Frank Barron. And Michael was very close with Tim for a long time. He was his archivist, and he and Cynthia have done a couple of what I think are interesting and important books. I first met Winona when she was like 14 years old, and I've heard of Al Jorgensen, but that was before I really got there. I decided to really concentrate on Tim in '93.
Mhm.
As I resigned from this Albert Hofmann Foundation, I realized there's a whole another story here with Timothy Leary. And I went to his house and I said, I had discovered that Hofmann had like different sort of anti-Semitic ways, and it kind of repulsed me. And I went to see Tim, and he just dazzled me with I was alone with him in his house for the weekend in '93, and just his presence and intelligence and sense of humor. And I thought, God, you're getting the shit end of the stick here in psychedelic history. I want to see if I can help, like put this book out that showed there's another side of you. But it turns out there's many sides of him. And I haven't spoken to Michael for many years. I know Michael, and there's a little that book that I did, I asked Michael if he wanted to do it with me, because he and I, sort of joke, like he and I are the like two most knowledgeable people about psychedelic history, although I have a slightly different perspective than him, and he is more into this kind of music scene and a different sort of use of drugs than me. And I got into, kind of conspiracy theories, and he was like, stay away from that. I really owe him a call, because I understand that he's just finished a book. He's writing his own kind of memoir of his time with
Wow.
Timothy. To me personally, he's been nothing but a good friend and supporter. You'll see in the introduction to that book that I thank him. Winona contributed to that book. There were several really fun nights when she would come by, and we would we were all on nitrous a lot of the time when we were at Tim's house, because he would use it to control his pain. And he liked other people to use it because he didn't want anybody being sad when he was dying. So we were all like sort of there'd be a nitrous tank at the door, and you'd come in, and someone would hand you a balloon, and you had this. So that was just sort of fun. But yeah, that's a little close to home because for many, many years that Michael and Cindy were like family to me.
Mm-hmm.
And there may be other aspects that I don't personally know about. So I can't really help you too much there.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I've those videos of like the last days of Timothy Leary. You always see him sitting there with a big balloon in his hand and, just adoring fans and friends walking in and out of the door. That must have been a pretty electric environment to be around at that time, I'm sure.
It was, but again, there's the public part of it. But there were other sides too.
Mhm.
It was for all the kind of joie de vivre that Tim put out about death as this great adventure, there's also, I don't think you ever escape the
Mhm.
terror of dying too. And there was certainly that.
Of
And there was
course.
a lot of mix of people that would come by. And yeah, I think that I keep on. I mean, I have a screenplay that I've almost finished that I keep on waiting because I'm learning more things. I don't want
Mhm.
to myself be typed as a Leary advocate because there are a lot of things about his career and life that I don't advocate. I want to tell an honest story. Um, but in this Renaissance, with so many millions of, I mean, Michael Pollan's book was by far the most popular. He criticizes Leary the whole way through as being, an advocate of psychedelic drugs, but Pollan has reached many, many more people,
Mhm.
asserting a different model of like government approved psychedelic stuff.
Yeah.
And like I said, Tim said that his greatest career was democratizing them, getting them out of the hands of the government. He didn't really want to talk about the conspiracy stuff and the CIA stuff with me. I was just starting to get into it. And he was, he kind of said, I wrote all that stuff. It's
Mhm.
more complicated than you think. Back in those days, Robert, the CIA was not all bad. Um, I can remember another memory I have. Oliver Stone brought over one of his films, and Tim and I were watching it. He and I were alone in the house, and we were watching his film, one of Stone's films, and Tim like broke down in tears. He just hated the darkness that Oliver Stone's kind of conspiracy thinking was,
Mhm.
like he didn't want it to be exposed, or but told me to take it out of the.
Why do you
Didn't
think
want to
that? Do you
watch.
think that was because it was a painful memory for Tim to think about? Do you think he thought it would kind of tarnish his legacy, for people to know that he was maybe not a part of, but taken advantage of, kind of an asset for some of these operations?
And he admits that he was. I think that he was
Right.
so against it because I think it really countered one of the fundamental means of his life was to be joyful, like always be smiling and not take anything too seriously. This is
Mhm.
where he found himself. To him, it was just like exciting and interesting. And then when these kind of forces came in, these you can call them demonic forces.
Mhm.
Characters like Crowley and CIA conspiracies and Operation Paperclip, and it got like getting thrown in jail for a 30-year sentence. Tim was like, what the fuck? This was like, whoa, 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 let's call this off. I just want to like live my life. But they would never let him live his life. He
Mhm.
was they keep coming back at him. And so he's a very important character to get right
Mhm.
in the psychedelic story. And it's very difficult to do that, like I said, because I consider him heroic for his anti-government stance. I'm repulsed by some of this other stuff. But my personal relationship with him was, he was very smart and methodical and honest and edgy, but you know, um, I love the guy. I was like I said, I remember one day there was a Harvard reunion. We had a Harvard reunion at his house, and all the guys that were students of his during those couple years at Harvard all came to his house. This is it was on St. Patrick's Day, he died in May, so this is just what, 2 months earlier. And he was really in his glory. I mean, he was just, in the wheelchair, and all these guys that loved him because he was such a great teacher. And he didn't really call himself a teacher. He was like coach. He's wheeling around in his wheelchair with his LA Dodgers hat on, and all these, people that had careers in psychology, and people that I really respected and liked a lot. Gunther Weil, Ralph Metzner, Paul Lee. I was there. I brought his son down from uh, Oakland. His son Jack, who he was estranged from for 15 or 20 years, and it was it was a really big day. I mean, they're singing for him and honoring. It was an Irish wake, and just honoring this guy for this role he played in history. And he was really, like I'm telling you, he was just like glowed like an illuminated being. He was near the end of his life, and he just had this magnificence. But then again, he would like twist, and there was another spirit there.
Mhm.
Hard to really say.
That's interesting. It probably isn't this, but the MK Ultra literature, and it talks about breaking down the psyche into two different people, kind of splitting the personality and either erasing old memories to implant new ones, or creating kind of these two personalities to switch to. You know what I mean? Do you know what I'm
I do.
referring to?
Well, you mentioned his book High Priest.
Hmm.
So he writes in High Priest about his first LSD trip,
Hmm.
where he says that he basically describes it as a psychotic break
Yeah.
that he never really recovered from. He said, I was never able to take anything seriously, even my children, after that. Like the whole world just became like a game. He kind of had that meme earlier because of his family upbringing, but that was this, and he warned people to stay away from LSD.
Hmm.
That's another part of the complexity of his life. He's known as the big LSD advocate, but after his first experience, the Harvard group up till that point was just working with psilocybin mostly, and mescaline, and he had the story with Michael Hollingshead bringing the LSD up. Tim didn't come back for a few days, and they thought they'd lost him, and they were like, that LSD, like, no fucking around with LSD. And then I don't know what, he got an assignment from CIA to try to hype LSD again, but then he also told people, let's not take this stuff till we know more about it.
Mm.
Again, he's sort of conflicted between this person that really honored truth and goodness, and it was a real humanitarian, and then realized that he was being used by nefarious forces that were way bigger than he had ever imagined, really.
What do you think could have been different in the world, or the trajectory of the psychedelic, renaissance, or whatever you want to call it, if Leary had come out at that time and said, hey, this thing is, we don't know everything about this yet, and there are nefarious forces behind the scenes promoting this, as opposed to, the other kind of promotion that he kind of did for a while, in a positive light. What do you think could have been different?
I don't know. That's an interesting question and a whole conversation, but I don't really know how to answer it. They weren't different. Well, we saw what was happening. I mean, in the early 60s when John Kennedy was
Mhm.
assassinated, this dark force, they don't fuck around.
Yeah.
I mean, they didn't if Tim had like taken a stand more like JFK, I mean, they just shot JFK in the face.
Yeah.
Um, Tim's character, this is his character they assassinated. Um, so I don't know. I'm getting a little tired now. So next time we talk, we can bring up these
Absolutely.
philosophical questions at the beginning.
Yes. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time today, Robert. It's been fantastic. Been a joy to talk about
Yeah,
this. So
yeah, we had a great conversation. Let me know when you get it up somewhere, and I'll share it with my friends. And So you have some things to teach me about Tool and some of these other music, and that's an assignment I'm going to give you for
Absolutely.
just bring me up to speed with McGowan's thesis and how it continued in this you know, 80s
Mhm.
and 90s era of
For
music.
a while, I actually started writing to try to do almost McGowan's part two, you know, of the more recent era of music and stuff, but it was quite an undertaking. So I'll work on that at some point, but there's a lot there. You know, there's a whole nother series of weird scenes in the Canyon books to be made, you know. So
Yeah. Hmm.
anywhere you want to plug or, you know, direct people to read more of your books or your work before we get off?
Well, you know, I like I'm still in a kind of liminal place. I mean, I have this website, but I'm actually going to take it down soon and redo it.
Okay.
Um, I'm a little embarrassed to say this, like my only like social media presence right now is Facebook, where I keep it pretty active. I think
Mhm.
maybe that's where you and I connected at first.
Yeah.
So I do still direct people there for now. I haven't written much on Substack, but I'm I have material sort of bubbling up.
Mhm.
So just Facebook, you know, come check out my website, alteredstatesofamerica.net. Let's keep this conversation fresh and let me know what people think and say, and we'll build our knowledge and do our work.
That sounds great to
How's
me.
that?
Thanks again, Robert. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, yeah. No, my pleasure, Noah. Good to meet you. Keep up the good work, and I look forward to more of our friendship.
You too. Thanks, Robert.
All right.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.